Good afternoon all. So today is the third session of a series of seminars organized by myself, Laurence Lux Sterrett, on behalf of my team, Britex 1718. And in that group, we've organized a series of seminars looking at religious scandals and how religious scandals are made visible or not visible. We are going to pay attention mostly not to the religious scandals in themselves, but also particularly, in fact, pay attention to the ways in which they are made visible, the strategies behind this making visible, or indeed the strategies behind the invisibilizing, if you wish, of those religious scandals. We've already had a first session in January, which was held in French, and we welcomed our colleague from Montpellier and Lyon, Elena Guimard, who talked about clerical tactics facing the Inquisition, and myself talking about nuns and men and love scandals in conventual archives in early modern convents in exile, English convents in exile. That was our first session in French. The second session was about the making visible of religious controversies with Caroline Galland, who gave a brilliant talk about mitigations and a particular scandal, Maurice scandal, between visibility and over visibility, and Claire Schiano-Locurcio, who talked about the writing of a scandal amongst the English poor clerks in exile. This is the second session. It was held in French as well. Both of those can be found on our YouTube channel, same as this one. And then today is the third session, the first one to be held in English, and we are going to hear Jaime Goodrich and Emilie Murphy discuss for us the huge dispute about spirituality, which tore apart, literally, the English convent at Brussels between the year 1620 and 1652. And when I say it tore them apart, I really mean it. They actually were separated for a long time. Okay, so this will be our third session and the last session for this university year, but there are two more to come. One about sexual scandals in October 2026, and one about the clandestine Jesuits and the visible Jesuits, to be held in December 2026. Today, therefore, let us welcome both our speakers, Jaime Goodrich, who's Chair and Professor of English at Wayne State University at the Center for Humanities, of which she is the Director. It would be too long to tell you everything she has published and all the talks she has given, but you've got some of her publications, etc., on her webpage. And a second speaker, and they've worked together on this particular topic, and therefore it is only natural that they should give this talk together. Emilie Murphy, who's Senior Lecturer in Early Modern History at the Center for Renaissance and Early Modern Studies in York, and she is the Director of that center. And again, you can see her publications, her talks, etc., upon her institutional page. So welcome to today's session about making religious scandals visible, disputing spirituality at the English convent in Brussels. Thank you.
Near the end of March 1632, 13 nuns in the English Benedictine convent in Brussels sent a lengthy letter to the Archbishop of Mecklenburg-Brussels, Jacobus Bohnen. At 14 pages and nearly 4,000 words in length, the petition extensively detailed the events that had taken place throughout Lent, when existing disagreements over spiritual direction between the authors, the pro-Percy faction, those who supported the abbess Mary Percy, and the appellants, those who had appealed to Rome for assistance after being prevented from accessing Jesuit priests as their extraordinary confessors, boiled over and became shockingly public. The letter carefully noted all the great evils and insupportable inconveniences threatening destruction to our monastery during the very time set aside for heightened devotion, fasting, and prayer before Easter, including the nuns physically and loudly wrestling with one another to control open services, all within earshot of the scandalised lay people present in the convent church.
Included the nuns physically and loudly wrestling with each other to control open services, all within the kind of scandalised earshot of the scandalised lay people present in the convent church. And the petition repeatedly returns to the fact that the conflict did not remain internal to the community. So on the first Saturday in Lent, the rival singing of two different factions in the choir made, in the pro-Percy faction's words, an insupportable discord and confusion to the great scandal of those who were in the church. On the 14th of March, the conflict became so severe that the religious, laying aside for a time the divine office, betook themselves to chiding and striving together in the choir. And the same happened a few days later on the feast of St. Benedict, as the religious again set about to strive and contend. So by the 26th of March, the pro-Percy nuns claimed that they had been forced to shut the choir door and to stay their office in private, rather than by irreverence in the church to offend God and scandalise those that come thither. So the scandal then lay not in disorder within the convent, but in the fact that this disorder, although obviously that was a problem, but in the fact that this disorder had become audible, visible, and then kind of textually reportable beyond the enclosed community. And so the question that Jamie and I will be addressing today is how this cloistered dispute became a public scandal and what kinds of textual labour were required to make that scandal visible. But first, how had it come to this?
From its foundation, the Benedictine monastery of Our Lady of the Assumption in Brussels was strongly associated with the Society of Jesus. When Lady Mary Percy, who we see here on the slide, arrived on the continent in 1597, she had intended to join a foreign convent, but the Jesuit William Holt convinced Percy to put her considerable dowry toward the foundation of a new Benedictine convent in Brussels for Englishwomen. This English convent would be part of the ongoing mission of Catholic recovery, and while Jesuit priests worked in England to convert their country, the nuns would sustain English monasticism and support the English mission through prayer. Using his extensive network in England and abroad, Holt secured the convent's formal establishment in 1598, obtaining personnel, permissions, and funding from English expatriates and local Catholics. He also provided the house of spiritual guidance. However, the constitutions of the Society of Jesus forbade him from serving as its ordinary confessor, whose duties would include officiating at Mass and hearing weekly confessions. Robert Chambers, a secular priest who was friendly with the Society of Jesus, therefore became the house's first ordinary confessor. Meanwhile, English Jesuits served as extraordinary confessors, leading spiritual retreats and giving individual instruction on meditation. Between 1598 and 1620, this division of spiritual labor benefited the house greatly, as many Englishwomen joined the Brussels Benedictines specifically because of the convent's strong identification with Ignatian piety and its ties to Jesuit priests. The Brussels nuns also gained political agency through their association with Jesuits, who were engaged in a struggle with secular priests over the future of the English mission. While Jesuits proved highly popular in England with their cutting-edge spiritual techniques, secular priests contended that they exercised a tyrannical control over the English Catholic community and undermined traditional ecclesiastical order. This charged atmosphere allowed the Brussels House and English Jesuits to develop a mutually beneficial relationship in which both parties worked together to enhance their spiritual authority as leading proponents of restoring English Catholicism. Yet, despite this initial success, the convent's reliance on multiple sources of spiritual direction also fostered divided loyalties that led to bitter disagreements over monastic authority and spirituality. After Percy became the convent's second abbess in 1616, she found herself at odds with Chambers and attempted to weaken the monastery's ties to the Jesuits. Fraught arguments had arisen over the use of Jesuits as extraordinary confessors and whether Ignatian spirituality was suitable for those professed within the Benedictine tradition, something that Percy no longer supported. This resulted in bitter disputes over spiritual direction. see. Archbishop Matthias Jovius held a visitation in 1620, but this intervention failed to resolve the tensions. In 1622, Percy received an English letter purportedly written by an anonymous individual on behalf of a group of unnamed Catholic nobles in England who were discontented with Percy's leadership. The writer compared the convent to the ruins of Troy, accused her of tyranny, and threatened to depose Percy or appoint a coabbess if she did not amend her overbearing behavior. Believing that English Jesuits had sent this letter in support of one of the nuns, Lucy Knatchbull, and her ambitions to hold a higher monastic office, Percy sought to lessen the house's reliance on Jesuits by appointing a highly divisive young secular priest named Francis Ward as a second ordinary confessor. Ward promptly generated an entirely new scandal, serious enough to require his own removal the following year, involving allegations of attempted seduction and kissing through the sacristy window. This first phase of controversy eventually ended after the departures of Chambers, Ward, and Lucy Knatchbull in 1624, the latter of whom left to establish a rival English Benedictine convent in Gant. Meanwhile, a second group of disaffected nuns had departed in late 1623 to help found a house in Cambrai. This phase of the scandals at Brussels was fairly localized, but was made visible through extensive correspondence from the nuns themselves. They composed individual letters and group petitions to the archbishop, either in French, if they had some competency in that language, or in English to be translated into French or Latin by their fellow nuns, family members such as Gabriel Colford, or the house's confessors. Men associated with the convent, including confessors and relatives of the nun, also shared their opinions with Boonen in either French or Latin letters. The next phase of the disputes, from 1628 to 1632, is marked by two factors. First, a more direct confrontation between secular and Jesuit priests. Second, the scandal moves beyond the local context to a significantly international framework. By 1628, the convent had been without an ordinary confessor for 4 years due to continued disagreements between the factions within the house. The House considered and rejected a series of candidates during this time, leading Boonen to take unilateral action that September by appointing Anthony Champney as ordinary confessor. This was a controversial choice, and perhaps Boonen hoped to weaken the House's reliance on Jesuits. Champney was a secular priest and had been heavily involved in the anti-Jesuit movement. He was one of 13 priests who had signed the hugely contentious protestation of allegiance to Queen Elizabeth I in 1603. While Champney and the other signatories had hoped to gain tolerance for English Catholics by showing loyalty to Elizabeth as their temporal sovereign, English Jesuits favored continued resistance to the governmental regime and opposed measures such as the protestation of allegiance. Many members of the Brussels convent similarly found Champney's conduct objectionable. Two strong factions emerged in the convent: a pro-Jesuit party led by Mary Vavasour, here we call them the Appellants, and a party in support of the abbess, Mary Percy, and her prioress, Agatha Wiseman. The pro-Jesuit nuns persistently requested Champney's dismissal through letters and group petitions, addressing themselves first to Boonen and other local authorities before turning to Rome. They accused Champney of heresy, schism, and licentious speech, while claiming that Percy was guilty of breaching the House's statutes, misusing its finances, and parricide by causing a nun's death through physical neglect. At the same time, Percy sent petitions to Rome and secured several victories. Not only did Champney remain in his post, but also the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith barred Jesuits from the convent in February 1630. As the trial dragged on, the appellants resorted to increasingly desperate measures to assert their autonomy, including forcibly seizing the sacristy. By this point, the dispute was no longer confined to disagreements within the cloister. It had generated letters, petitions, and appeals to authorities in both Brussels and Rome. On 17 February 1632, the archbishop and the papal nuncio came to the convent to negotiate a settlement between the two warring factions, and it is at this point that we'll return to the letter we started with.
Okay, so to obey your lordship's command, the pro-Percy faction explained, they had put down in writing such things as have most disturbed the common peace and increased our dissensions and troubles since the 17th of February. The settlement agreement presented to the convent by the nuncio and the archbishop stipulated that the appellants would resign their monastic offices and depart to establish a new convent with the sum of 14,000 scudi. So the nuncio, the archbishop, and the pro-Percy nuns all believed that the appellants had agreed to these terms. As the pro-Percy faction exclaimed in the petition, they wrote, "There was made a general agreement amongst all the religious, as well the appellants, as my lady and hers, which the appellants did plainly show by their congratulations with some of us, as a controversy now ended. However, the appellants claimed soon afterwards that the interpreter appointed to translate for them when the nuncio and the archbishop had come had misrepresented their consent to the settlement, and disruption then ensued. So on the first Monday in Lent, which was the day appointed for the abbess to call the community together to effect the change of convent officers, the appellants arrived prepared. So they had instructed a notary and an advocate who that morning arrived in the church to present legal documents to the abbess immediately after she had received communion. So the paperwork has been thrust through the very same grill that had moments earlier served as the conduit for the body of Christ, creating what the pro-Percy faction described as a tumult in the choir. In the chapter house afterwards, the appellants were mutinous, and one appellant, Dame Mary Phillips, cried out that we confirm all the officers in their offices. So they were not having any new elections. Furious. So the abbess withdrew, and the Percy faction conducted the elections elsewhere, which meant that there were two sets of convent officers now in post, and neither recognised the authority of the other. So convent officers, just to explain, are people in charge of various aspects of conventual life. And one such position was the chantress, and this is the nun in charge of the choir. And this was a particular problem. So the choir is the site of the divine office, so the central communal labour of Benedictine life. And over the following weeks, it transformed into a site of violent struggles as rival chantresses and members of their respective factions sought to assert control over the liturgy. So according to the pro-Percy faction, in their petition, confusions were made daily in the places where the convent meet, but especially in the choir, by occasion of the deposed deans and chantress who will still hold their places and offices. Eventually, the Archbishop instructed armed men to remove the leading appellants from the house by force in the middle of the night during Holy Week in April of 1632, allowing the remaining nuns to celebrate Easter in peace. So both internal and material evidence from the petition, that's here on the slide, make plain that the pro-Percy nuns were aware of the need to legitimise their own version of events that had taken place. So as the nuns themselves acknowledge in their opening lines, the impetus for the letter's composition originated with the Archbishop himself, like to obey his command. They've set this down in writing. And as is the case in so many other convent writings, like nuns' autobiographies and spiritual treatises, the missive comes then from the direct order of a male superior. And in this case, Boonan's request reflects not only the close coordination between the pro-Percy nuns and local ecclesiastical officials, but also a need to gather documentation as he moved towards the dramatic step of forcibly removing the appellants from the convent. A glance at the manuscript itself also immediately reveals the petition's plural female authorship. So Prioress Wiseman wrote the nearly 4,000-word petition in a neat italic hand on behalf of members of her faction. And these women in turn individually endorsed one or more of the 28 numbered points in the letter by adding kind of autograph signatures in the margins, which attested to their personal witnessing of the events that had taken place. So the authority of this document then lies in these traces of collaborative authorship, which legitimize the words of the signatories, prioress and scribe. So in a monastic setting that privileged corporate identity over individuality, a collective text of this kind carried much more weight than a work composed by a single nun. So this was the first mechanism by which scandal was made visible and credible. So the disorder in the choir has been transformed into a series of like numbered incidents, and these incidents are then attached to named witnesses, and these witnesses are collectively authorising Wiseman's account. So the petition's authority depends not just on what's being said then, but on how it kind of makes visible the process by which the account has been gathered and witnessed and endorsed. So the decision to write this petition in English to their non-Anglophone archbishop also demonstrates the strategic importance of language in relation to textual production and the processes of making this scandal visible. So from the early 1620s on, issues with interpreters and translators had played a significant role in the disputes among the Brussels Benedictines, arguably fueling their publicity by requiring the nuns to use intermediaries for assistance. It was highly unusual for male superiors and civic officials in continental Europe to speak much, if any, English during this period, as many of the women could only write in English. They were forced, therefore, to rely either on the linguistic expertise of their fellow nuns, like Wiseman, who was fluent in French and literate in Latin, or external interpreters. So a few years earlier, on the 5th of August 1628, the pro-Percy nun Catherine Parson had written to the Archbishop on behalf of several others within the convent who lacked language skills to accuse an appellant, Mary Phillips, who was fluent in Dutch, of manipulating the convent's visitor, Henry Calanus, to make him support her point of view, thanks to her linguistic ability. And there were also further allegations made in the convent that people were being persuaded to sign co-authored letters to the Archbishop in languages that they didn't understand. So the pro-Percy faction's decision to send their petition here in English to the Archbishop is therefore significant because it meant that there wouldn't be any suggestion that the women signing their names didn't understand the content of the complaint. Next slide, please, Jamie. Two further facts indicate that the group made a highly conscious decision to send this petition in English. And the first is that an earlier draft of the same complaint survives in French in Wiseman's hand, and that's on the left of the slide here. And then second, the pro-Percy faction sent a much shorter summary of the same letter a few days later in French, which was written in Wiseman's hand and signed by the same women, with the notable addition of Mary Percy herself. So this is the letter that's on the right of your screen. And this version bears a Latin annotation from the 29th of March, 1632, which is in the hand of Henry Calanus, the convent visitor, stating that he had visited the convent to gather testimony about the disturbances. So I want to pause a bit now on the French draft, which is on the left. So the existence of this draft of the petition offers additional insight into another aspect of kind of composite authorship and linguistic pluralism in the convents, and that's collaborations between nuns and clergy. So an anonymous hand has made intermittent corrections to the text. And while we haven't been able to identify this hand with certainty, it was possibly Anthony Champney, the convent's ordinary confessor, or maybe more likely Henry Calanus, the convent's visitor. The location of this manuscript in the archive of the Archdiocese of Mecklenburg-Brussels might provide circumstantial evidence in favour of Calanus, but nevertheless, Wiseman had a copy at hand while she was composing the English complaint, because she's incorporated this hand's corrections into the version that was also sent. So, for example, the editor alters Wiseman's use of the first person in her French draft and has also on occasion suggested that she uses different verbs to describe the appellant's actions. So one example here is when Wiseman is talking about two nuns singing rival tunes on the 14th of March, an appellant, Winifred Tresham, is described as pulling a book out of the pro-Percy nun Christina Paris's hands while she was singing. And in the French, Wiseman has originally used the verb ravir, which you might be able to see here. It's underlined on this page. But then the male corrector has suggested that she replaces this with arracher, forgive my bad accent. And I don't need to don't tell this Francophone audience, but ravir is kind of dramatic and forceful, but arguably not necessarily violent. Whereas arracher, by contrast, means more to kind of pull out or tear away or snatch, and I think implies a sort of stronger physical effort. And the correction was therefore encouraging Wiseman to characterize the encounter more forcefully. And these alterations gesture toward the high levels of trust and intimacy between the pro-Percy nuns and an ecclesiastical superior, whether Champney or Calanus. And at the same time, the existence of both this draft and the revised copy allows us a first-hand glimpse of an otherwise unacknowledged co-authorship that subtly shaped the final visible document. So the hand of the English petition is that of the nun, Agatha Wiseman, and the signatories who established her authority are also nuns. But then the contributions of the male editor, invisible as they may be in the final example, constitute an additional layer of textual labour that's not apparent in the final document. So part of the process then of making the scandal ultimately visible is itself kind of hidden unless you have access to this earlier draft. And finally, the petition illustrates the way that the Brussels nuns revised text in order to assert their own narrative of the controversies. So in addition to incorporating the anonymous hand's corrections into her English petition, Wiseman revised her original count of the events in the choir. So her earlier French draft covered the events up to the 24th of March when Boonen visited the monastery in an attempt to calm things down. And the language of both the letters, when you compare them, is parallel where they're describing the same events. It's very, very similar. However, the French complaint is around 1,000 words, kind of shorter than the English one. And a comparison reveals that the additions in the petition in the English version all serve to underline the anti-authoritarian conduct of the appellants and to enhance their aggression and violence, while simultaneously removing any ambiguity over the pro-Percy faction's behaviour. So there are numerous examples, but the events on the feast day of St. Gregory on the 12th of March are particularly illustrative, I think. So on this day at High Mass, the abbess had ordained that a tract that would usually have been sung by 2 or 3 of the nuns, which were normally appointed by the chantress, should instead just be sung by everyone in order to avoid like the rival chantresses appointing their own people and then having a discord. And in the French draft, Wiseman notes how the appellants received this direction with laughter before running over to the desk and covering the book so that the nuns couldn't see to sing. And this is in the top left. In the left-hand side is the French and the right-hand side is the English. Récipient avec de ruse, you can see in the middle of the thing. Anyway, but in the English version, the appellants react instead, rather than with laughter, but with great violence, is what the English letter says instead. And subsequently, in the French text, it states that the appellants were constrained by the pro-Percy nuns Marina Dracot and Christina Paris. They're mentioned by name, but this is removed completely from the English version, which instead notes quite vaguely that the appellants were hindered by my ladies religious. And so in doing that, Wiseman shifted the agency away from kind of named individuals to the kind of corporate body of the convent, diluting any personal responsibility and kind of muting any admission that perhaps any specific pro-Percy nuns had used force. And the change also sharpens the kind of asymmetry of the narrative. So the appellants are routinely individualized and cast as violent, while the pro-Percy faction are a collective disciplined community that merely hinder disorder. And then the final most notable alteration relates to Abbess Mary Percy's attempts to intervene. So in the French version, the abbess is quoted as crying out. So I'm not going to, for this French audience, I'm not going to possibly read it out in French, but it's at the bottom of the letter at the bottom left of your screen. So she says that she's crying out like leave these contentions at the divine office is the English translation before she receives a blow to the hand is what it says, like à la main, from Mary Phillips. But in the English petition, it entirely omits the abbess's kind of passionate cries while strengthening the violence of the appellants, where it says, my lady coming to them to hinder their strife, willing them not to strive so at mass, received a blow to the face of Mary Phillips. So Wiseman consciously then drew on the inherent mobility and diversity of texts, in this case using a French draft edited by a male cleric to produce an English final copy signed by other nuns to shape the convent's collective representation of events. The English petition made appellant disorder highly visible. Their laughter is instead it's transformed into violence. So they're made kind of aggressive, and an encounter with Percy goes from a kind of smack on the hand to a blow to the face. And then at the same time, the petition makes the pro-Percy force kind of less visible by removing names, softening verbs, and presenting the faction as a disciplined and unified, acting only to kind of restrain disorder.
The events of Lent 1632 were repeatedly written, rewritten, translated, summarized, and recirculated. The corpus arising from the entirety of the scandals at Brussels spans over 1,000 manuscripts now extant in archives across Europe. It is multilingual and multinational, reflecting the steady production and circulation of texts by the factions within the convent, their English Catholic allies, both in exile and in England, and ecclesiastical officials in the Low Countries, England, and Rome. The corpus provides a fascinating example of how early modern writers,
Is Jamie frozen for everyone?
Yes, I was just about to ask. It's frozen for me as well.
Okay, I'll carry on. The corpus provides a fascinating example of how early modern writers, including women, an identity marginalized in both society and the Catholic Church, made visible a local controversy with international ramifications. So Marie-Louise Coulihan has observed that layers, to quote her, layers of mediation were at play in nuns' textual production within English convents abroad. I'm sorry now that you've lost the slides. A lot of them are just
illustrations of what
illustrations, although actually we're about to get to Jamie's Latin bit. So anyway, we'll see how we go. Anyway, yeah, Marie-Louise has observed that layers of mediation were at play in nuns' textual production within English convents abroad, and the corpus illustrates this point. Jamie is back.
I'm so sorry, I don't know what happened. It just cut out.
This is a disaster. I'm sorry, Laurence. I just picked up after Marie-Louise's quote, and we just need the PowerPoint back on slide 10.
Okay, all right. Do
you
want me to?
You can take your time, Jamie. There's no need to rush. Emily, there's no need to rush. We have plenty of time.
All right, good. So I will, okay, let me get started then. So Emily, let's see if I can get this. There we go. So you picked up at Marie-Louise's quote.
Yeah, I just quoted Marie-Louise, so then you can.
Okay, great. I kept reading until suddenly there was no one there. All right, well, I'll pick back up there. So after the dramatic events of Easter 1632, both factions presented and represented the series of events for a variety of audiences as the two parties debated the circumstances that led to the appellant's expulsion. Intertextuality, including allusion, quotation, and wholesale incorporation of other texts, is widely evident throughout the corpus, with and without attribution. The pro-Percy faction's accounts informed later accounts written by Percy's supporters. As we have been describing, the pro-Percy faction emphasized liturgical disruptions caused by the appellants, which struck at the convent's ability to perform the essential labor of Benedictine life, the divine office and Mass. Percy's supporters note that the initial disturbance on the first Saturday of Lent, which is the 6th of March, 1632, created great scandal among those who were in the church, presumably lay people, as the rival factions made an insupportable discord and confusion by singing two different tunes. Jacobus Boonen later drew on this complaint in his own historical account of the events, further sensationalizing the appellant's actions by adding inflammatory language and reshaping the sequence of events. In discussing the original incident on the 6th of March, he claims there was heard not an English or angelical harmony, but a diabolical discord to the great injury of divine service and scandal and laughter of strangers. An earlier draft of Boonen's account reveals that he or his secretaries devoted particular attention to this passage, carefully reworking their initial wording in order to add in a reference to the laughter of outsiders, which was not present in his original phrasing, which I'll just give in an English translation, which was with great dissonance, irreverence, injury of the divine service, and the scandal of external listeners. The contemporary English translation of Boonen's narrative underscores the appellant's disrespect for the liturgy by inserting the marginal comment, a black sanctus, a parodic hymn associated with devil worship, which reflects Boonan's use of satanic language and presents the appellant's behavior as a devilish satire of the liturgy. As Celeste McNamara has recently shown, fear and concern over scandal was deeply embedded in Christian theology from the New Testament on. It had the power to undermine both ecclesiastical authority and the faith of all witnesses. By emphasizing such scandalous disrespect for liturgical order, Boonan, the pro-Percy nuns, and Boonan's unknown English translator implied that their opponents were incapable of fulfilling their vocation and lacked proper respect for God. Similarly, Boonan and the pro-Percy faction presented the appellants as subversive rebels who refused to acknowledge the authority of their monastic superiors, in this case, the new office holders and Percy. In the petition from around March 26th, the appellants are described as making a mutiny when the convent assembled for the election of new officers on the 1st of March, after which they read aloud a paper in which they had prepared contrary to the order of chapter, and in a tumultuous manner they filled the chapter with clamors and confusions. The language of mutiny, sedition, and unruliness is present in every single letter from the pro-Percy faction. Boonan draws freely on the nuns' accounts in order to present the appellants as disobedient to the point of violence. On St. Benedict's Day, Mary Percy had written directly to Boonan in French, with Wiseman as a scribe, with a highly compressed account of the events, noting that your lordship has undoubtedly heard of the great discords that have arisen in our convent since the recent election of officers, because the former officers strive with all their might to maintain themselves in their offices, from which necessarily come daily and incessantly great discords, unbearable tumults, and disturbances, mainly in the choir and refectory, which continue to increase, not without notable scandal to the world, the deplorable detriment of our souls and risk to our bodily health. She went on to note the fight in the choir earlier that day, which included an appellant, Flavia Langdale, falling to the ground, although Percy does not name her, noting simply that she says her health is harmed, even though the nun who is said to have thrown her down solemnly protests that she did not even touch her, another of their company being between them when she fell. Percy's brief account surfaces in Boonan's narrative, but he went one step further and reordered events to underline the appellant's sedition. Boonan explains how these disobedient nuns de facto resisted the new officers and caused the resulting violence in the choir. Insomuch in a tumult, one of the disobedient falling down, blood issued forth, and the lady abbess herself, endeavoring to repress this turbulent company, was smitten upon the face in the choir by one of these disobedient nuns. However, Percy was allegedly struck on the face by Mary Phillips on St. Gregory's Day, the 12th of March, and since this incident took place well before Langdale's fall, Boonan condenses the chronology so that the reader focuses on the attack against Percy rather than Langdale, who again was not even named. As shown by a scribal copy edited in Boonan's own hand, the Archbishop clearly intended to create this effect. He revised the text to emphasize Percy's victimhood, saying that she was struck in the face by one of the disobedient nuns. So here he crosses out received a blow and added in was struck in the face. By changing the phrasing from active, she received, to passive, she was struck, and adding an explicit reference to Percy's face, Boonan places the blame for this incident squarely on the appellants and in the process underscores their lack of respect for superiors. Since the Benedictine rule observes that the abbess occupied the place of Christ within the cloister, the physical violence against Percy demonstrated a lack of respect for her as a person, as a superior, and as God's representative. The appellant's behavior was not only anti-hierarchical, but also implicitly blasphemous. As the stories moved from French to English to Latin to English again, each new version incorporated elements of previous tellings in ways that are only made visible when the entire constellation of text is read as a whole. The most public and obvious example of intertextuality from the convent is the dueling polemics of the two factions, a brief and sincere relation circulated by the appellants around 1633, and innocency justified and insolency repressed, circulated by the pro-Percy nuns in 1634. These two polemics exist in a single manuscript now located in the British Library. The appellants composed a brief and sincere relation in order to counteract the damage done to their reputations after being evicted from the monastery. The pro-Percy faction responded in turn with innocency justified, which defends the settlement as necessary due to the appellant's disobedience, even as it offers a blow-by-blow rebuttal of a brief and sincere relation. Indeed, Innocency Justified offers an extreme case of intertextuality, since it reproduces and comments on each paragraph of a brief and sincere relation. Both polemics cite a wide range of other texts, most notably the Brussels Statutes, the Benedictine Rule, and the Bible. Since the controversies centered on divergent interpretations of the Brussels Statutes, that work is by far the most cited text within the entire corpus. While the polemics sometimes silently incorporate language from the statutes, they also directly cite them or refer to specific clauses by part, chapter, and article. The polemics also reference or cite an array of other Brussels texts that were related to the controversies, such as sermons delivered by Champney, attestations of various nuns, most notably a deathbed attestation of Mary Watson in favor of Champney, letters and accounts sent by various nuns to readers outside the cloister, including the Archbishop, Roman authorities, and the English Catholics, and then, of course, the settlement itself. The polemics also incorporate documents that are represented as being complete, an attestation made by Ursula Hewick in 1631 and a letter sent by Percy to the Congregation of Regulars in 1631. These intertextual moments constitute an important source of authority for both polemics, yet such legitimacy could be challenged if the documents were referenced rather than included. For example, the appellant sent the Archbishop a letter in 1629 that he and the pro-Percy nuns construed as threatening a lawsuit. A brief relation claims that when this epistle was read aloud to the convent, it was revealed as not a threatening of a process, but a humble petition to avoid the necessity of a process in law. A marginal note in the text acerbically comments, "Produce the letter if ye will be believed." As each faction composed texts that referenced and repackaged other works, they relied heavily upon textual diversity to shape and control the narrative about events in the convent and its visibilization to the world. The relation between textual diversity and mobility during the disputes over spirituality at the English Benedictine convent in Brussels is seen nowhere more clearly than in the writings of Agatha Wiseman, whose elegant italic hand is ubiquitous throughout the corpus. And without her efforts, there is no doubt that the pro-Percy faction's position would have been made significantly less visible. And here I've chosen just some random, not totally random, but these texts all come from different archives. So on the left, we have something that is in Rome. On the top, we have something that's in England. And then the bottom two come from the Archbishop's archives in Mechlin. So we can see the spread of how her text spread across Europe. Not only was Wiseman fluent in French, but she also gained a limited continental fame for her Latin poem honoring her famous kinsman, Bennet Fitch, alias Canfield. But before and after the controversies, Wiseman regularly sent her own personal requests to the Archbishop in French. At the time of Champney's appointment, Wiseman was prioress, and she quickly became the scribe and translator of choice for Percy and her supporters. Not only was Wiseman trilingual, but she also staunchly defended her abbess and became a target of the appellant's violence as a result. For those in the know, Wiseman's hand alone would have conveyed authority and monastic order. In addition to composing petitions and letters in English and French for the Percy faction, Wiseman made numerous copies of key documents in English, French, and Latin that can be found today in Belgium, England, and Rome. She kept the English clergy back home supplied with essential texts, including the appellant's lawsuit, and she produced French translations for the Archbishop of Mechlin-Brussels. Furthermore, Wiseman was likely responsible for translating Percy's letters into Latin for Roman authorities. Functioning much like a one-woman scriptorium, Wiseman ensured that ecclesiastical officials received copies of essential documentation at the trial, and she served as a conduit for transmitting the nuns' writings to continental readerships without English. A scribe, translator, and author in her own right, Wiseman's textual production exemplifies the way that textual diversity, in the form of composite authorship, intertextuality, and linguistic pluralism, enabled convent writings to advocate for the nuns' interests with audiences across Europe.
Okay, to sum up briefly then, in exploring how this scandal became visible through forms of collaborative authorship and the circulation of texts across languages and borders, the Brussels corpus illuminates the mechanisms through which cloistered women intervened in public debates. So far from passive participants, the nuns' multilingual and composite writings demonstrate the ways in which early modern religious women negotiated authority and authorship within and far beyond the confines of enclosure. The Brussels disputes therefore invite us to reconsider the boundaries between private devotion and public controversy, forms of manuscript and print publication, and female and clerical authority. And they also invite us to think about scandal not simply as a kind of event or even as a revelation, but as a kind of process. The disturbances of Lent in 1632 became scandalous because they were made visible, audible, credible, and mobile, but first in the choir, before lay witnesses, then in petitions to the Archbishop, then in kind of various translations and summaries, and then in kind of various forms of historical writing as well, and also in the polemics that were addressed to English Catholics more broadly. And in tracing some of these multilingual and mobile texts, we can recover not only the nuns' voices, but also the networks, so spiritual, linguistic, institutional, through which early modern women shaped transnational Catholic culture. The end.
Thank you so much, Emilie and Jaime. Indeed, it's been there's a lot to unpack. Basically, there's so much to unpack, even for people who are familiar with the corpus, even for people who know, and have read, like myself, the manuscript. It is such a dense story, and it unfolds over so many years as well. And I think one of your points of expertise, which is on the linguistic aspects, is incredibly important in order to understand better how events are, pardon me, fashioned not only by the people who intend to narrate an event, but also by the people who are put in charge of translating those texts that are entrusted into them. And it's incredibly important to do the work that you've been doing, which is to compare various drafts, translations, retranslations of the same text, narrating the same events, but for different audiences and in different languages. So thank you very much for that. I will not hold the forum for too long. Do we have any questions or any comments from people in the audience? There's always a little delay when we are on Zoom for people to perhaps dare to manifest. No? Okay, well, I will start, and then maybe people will have other questions later. In order to analyze the scandal, or when you analyze the scandal, rather, what do you think, now that you are so very familiar with this corpus, what do you think was most scandalous to them? I'm not being very clear here. What I mean is, obviously, the events, the Black Sanctus, the fact that they fought over the service, the office, etc., was obviously very ungainly, very unworthy, really, of religious behavior. But was that per se scandalous unto God and unto, therefore, their rules, or was the great discomfort arising from the fact that it escaped their control? And in that way, do you think the fact that it was indeed visible and audible, as you said, Emilie, I mean, you work with sounds a lot, it was audible to all. We didn't see the nuns, but they could hear the cacophony that ensued. Does that tell us something about the importance of not just the conflict, but the fact that it became known, and to whom it became known? Because obviously there was a lot riding on being honorable in the neighborhood, people attending the mass, etc., being edified. Here they were rather disedified, weren't they? I'm sorry, I rambled a lot here.
Yeah, I mean, I think these things kind of all go hand in hand, don't they? That it is scandalous to God, and that probably is the true scandal. But then when it's scandalous to the world, then you layer in their reputation. right? And then the reputation of English Catholics more generally, and and English exiles, and so that initial scandal is just compounded. I mean, I think it's bad enough that they have embarrassed themselves in front of God, but does everybody have to know about it? That's kind of my thinking, and about it. And then it's an embarrassment too to the men who are supporting these various factions as well. So then there's some strong stakes in proving that the other party was to blame, right? And absolving the preferred party of any blame whatsoever. So I would say it's both. It's both, and it's the way that they interconnect with one another. Because, there are other convent scandals. I've been thinking quite a bit about the Poor Clares, who have a similar scandal around Jesuits. But that scandal is whatever, the things that happened there. The lid was kept on, so it's much harder to figure out exactly what happened. We have a little bit of documentation, but this is something altogether different. And the scandal breathes and lives because it is visible, and people are sharing this outside of the convent, as early as the early 1620s. And so then it just grows from there. Whereas the Franciscans, for whatever reason, were much better at not sharing it. So I think it's bad enough, like I said, that they did this in the choir, but then the fact that it became so public is the true scandal. And the scandal is the scandal, if that makes sense. It might sound redundant, but it is making it public. It's the fact that it's visible.
Yeah, and I think what's also quite striking is that both sides are using the word scandal to describe what's happening. Like the appellants are also referring to these things as a great scandal to the world. I also feel like we don't hear enough from the appellants in the corpus, right? It's so skewed. There's so much more, I think, from the Pope Percy nuns. So I just think about the letter that's written to the Francesco Barberini, where the appellants talk about the scandal of having been dragged into the street. They claim they're in their undergarments, but that's contested. But yeah, so they anyway, they clearly also feel scandalized, I think, by the entire situation. But yeah, it's definitely because it's visible that it compounds, as Jamie's said.
Thank you very much. Luke, you raised your hand. Thank you, Luke.
Yes, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. I'm a little acquainted through Laurence and Claire with the vagaries of some of these ladies. I have a question concerning the effect on the growth or development of the convent one way or another, through the impact this may have had back home in England on the Catholic community. Did it impede its growth? Did it impede or stop its funding? Or was the thing more publicized on the continent than towards the home community? Thanks.
Great question. I mean, I would say that it was definitely publicized among the home community. And, we've lost quite a bit of these documents, but the polemics are in response to earlier documents that were sent to England. So Percy's writing just general letters to England, and the appellants are writing general letters to England, and they're all, trying to argue their case. And vocations just plunge. So new entrants plunge at the Brussels house. For a period, there's a moratorium on them, but the Archbishop's trying to get a handle on the situation. But really, you can see a dive in women who want to enter the convent, it was the number one convent for English women wanting a vocation, wanting to join a continental house. It was the number one convent for that. And it's only in the 1650s when one of the pro-Jesuit, Mary Vavasour, becomes abbess, then the house is able to consolidate itself, come back together, and vocations start to rise again once that connection to the Jesuits is made clear and strong again. So yes, this absolutely impacted entrances. That's an interesting question about the finances. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but my strong suspicion is that they would have lost alms. And certainly one of the recurring complaints is poverty after this point, that they don't have enough to keep things going. And part of what happens is when the appellants split off, they take their dowries with them, or a portion of their dowries, and they take a lot of church stuff and house stuff with them. And so it impoverishes the mother house, the original house, the Brussels house. So there's just a lot in the records about poverty and, being unable to afford candles and that kind of thing. So yes, I would say it impacted the house very seriously.
I think it's also kind of a little hard to quantify and measure, because also this is happening during the Civil War and then the interregnum. So across the board, recruitment for the cloisters is waning somewhat. It's certainly not a boom era. And I have no evidence to back this up, but I am wondering how much that period of time almost did them a favor. That the fact that there was so much going on in England, like, it did help them ultimately to sweep things under the carpet, because I think what's really striking is, like, by the 1670s and 80s, this is just being swept under the historical rug. Like, no one in this kind of boom time where the convents are helping contribute to, like, new kind of histories of the Benedictine order, and like other abbesses from other convents are writing kind of historical collections. This is all just being, like, not spoken of, purposefully omitted, and things being manipulated in ways that are quite interesting. Yeah.
If I may, Emilie, when we look at the recruitment numbers, now just from the top of my head, I probably will get this wrong, but I believe that in the 1630s or 1640s maybe, Brussels, if we stay within the Benedictine order, Brussels only recruited two new postulants, I think, whereas the competitor house, the Jesuit house, which was in Ghent, recruited many more, I think something like 40 in the same decade. So we've got a very, very significant drop on the one hand, which benefits the competitor directly during that same time. Elizabeth is saying that regarding scandal, the controversy around the liturgy is audible, but also it's very, very disruptive to the spiritual well-being of those who attend the convent church. Absolutely. And if it doesn't get resolved, then the lay people are potentially in peril. And of course, that does probably influence alms to a great extent. So thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on Emily's comments about the later history. So, in the 1680s, you have Anne Neville as an abbess at a different English Benedictine convent. She's collecting documents from Brussels to write this history of 5 different Benedictine houses. And I think Vavasor puts it this way: there was some dissension made over the statutes. Right? That's but then it was resolved in favor of the statutes, so we're all fine. And then, as Laurence and I have seen, if you go farther out, then you hit the Victorian abbess of this house, saying things like, "I'm going to censor the manuscripts," and then pages are razored out, out of later historical accounts. And so there is, even up into the 20th century, there is an attempt to control the story. The problem is that these documents are all in ecclesiastical archives that the nuns can't just destroy. And so there's this sense of peril in these Victorian and abbesses' discovery of the ecclesiastical documents also that they can't destroy. And then there are several nun historians who try to write the story and are told, there's one in the Victorian era and there's one in the 20th century, and are told, you may not write this story because it is too damaging to the house. Even after the house had dissolved, due to lack of vocations, one nun was told I think it was the 1960s, well, some of the members are still alive and this would be too embarrassing. So we can't have this story out there. You need to stop your research. So there is a sense that they continue trying to put a lid on the scandal, but because the manuscripts exist and because there are so many of them, as we said, Laurence knows there's over 1,000. It's kind of hard to hide that if you go and look in the right places. So it's interesting because they continually are trying to put it under the rug, but it doesn't stay conveniently hidden. It slides back out from under the rug again and again. There's some little difference. Exactly. Thank you, Laurence. Right.
It's one of the challenges of such a large scandal. It's that, of course, it's not going to be very edifying for future generations. So they've done everything in their power to keep it hidden to an extent. And when there is an endeavor at collecting all the different manuscripts in order to write a combined history of the Benedictine endeavors in their 5 different communities, obviously they suddenly rediscover this purposefully forgotten part of their history. And then is the question, what are we allowed to say? How far can we reveal some of those damaging elements and pieces of information? And usually the order comes from above to say, no, you cannot talk about it, you cannot write about this. So it becomes forgotten, but only from the chronicles or the histories that have been compiled. But as you say, there remain all those manuscripts, which means that, I don't know, to an extent, I'm wondering about the Poor Clares. How do we not have an equivalent cache of documents that could tell us more about this? What happened to it? Did they not communicate their difficulties with the same, perhaps, openness? Were they less querulous and therefore they didn't write as much to make their voices heard? And by being less contentious in a way, history has lost that trace more easily, because for the Benedictines, there's no escaping the detective eye of the scholar that you are, Jamie. And
I mean, I wonder if it's partly because the Benedictines were under the jurisdiction of the archbishop. And so that's where about 800 of the manuscripts are. And, like there was in the early 20th century, Pasteur edited some of the things that are in Rome. And so that was visible, but they weren't translated. And I remember when I began this project, I thought, oh, I'll translate those letters and then I'll just see what else is out there. And I asked Claire Walker, I said, are there any other nuns? I was just looking for nuns letters in general. I'll just do some nuns letters. She said, oh, go to Mechlin. And I went, and it was like brought out, those of you who've been there, it's like stack after stack that's like this big. And then you realize, oh no, I'm lost in a whirlpool here just around this one house. And so I wonder if it's because the Poor Clares didn't, that maybe the archive just didn't survive in the same way because it didn't have that ecclesiastical stability. I don't know. Because what does survive of the France, and Claire will know this better than I, but I feel that it's mainly in Rome and there's not that much there.
Anyone else maybe with a question, a comment? It could be anything, of course.
Maybe just about the Poor Clares, as Jamie said, we about the scandal, we only have the chronicle. That there is a narrative created by the Poor Clares about the chronicle, and that is a very partial perspective on the scandal, and the other sources are in Rome and are written in Latin, so that they are not easy to navigate, I would say. So yeah, and I think the sources about the scandal were not part of the archival material they've decided to take back when they went to England as well. So yeah.
Yeah, it makes me wonder about the English Franciscan province and like where are their archives? I've never looked, but to think about some of the male superiors for that convent. I will say that the Percy polemic, I really enjoy it because it has a very literary verve to it. And it begins with, well, some people should say that we should just leave corpses buried, but we're going to dig this one up because we need to protect our honor, basically. And so there is a sense that there's a very public-facing aspect to the Brussels convent situation that is not the case for the Poor Clares. They are not writing polemics, as far as we know, that circulate to all English Catholics talking about this corpse scandal. They're much more circumspect, and I don't know if that has maybe even something to do with monastic identity and humility. Percy was accused of being proud and overbearing, and you definitely see it in some of the materials that she sends out. I'm a Percy. You can't do this to me. I'm going to put my story out there. You get that feeling from her. So it may have been, partly kind of the temperament of the individuals involved, but also, the poor Clares are very much about circumspection and modesty. The Benedictines are like that too, but the Poor Clares seem to be more like that, if that makes sense, because you're evacuating yourself of all personal identity as much as you can to get that poverty. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and it's probably linked as well to the fact that the Poor Clares really needed the support of lay people and patrons to survive, probably. So they really tried to sort of invisibilize the scandal as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were less affluent, obviously, than the Benedictines to begin with, and didn't have the same channels or resources that they could call upon. So obviously, living up from the alms of lay people, you really try possibly to keep a lid on anything that could damage that channel, really. You talked about metaphorically digging up a corpse. And that put me in mind of what happened to the separated nuns, because some of those nuns, the quarrelsome ones, etc., were, as you explained, then for a while allowed to stay in the convent, but in a different part of the convent, and they even occupied by force certain parts of the convent. And a while later, when one of them died, or in fact it was two, one had made an apology and recognized that she was wrong, etc., and would be allowed to be buried in the consecrated grounds of the convent, whereas there was a whole difficulty about burying the body of the other, who had been very, unabashed and not repentant. So it is also about, seceding from the community in life means that you cannot be reintegrated a posteriori into the community after your death. And that was quite interesting as well, because, even post-mortem, the stigma follows you. You're no longer part of that community.
Yeah, I think Percy says something, because she has a whole back and forth with the authorities. You need to fulfill the duty of burying the dead. This is an important work of mercy, etc. And Percy just says, and they say, and she's dead now, so she won't be troublesome to you. And Percy says she will be as untroublesome in death as she was in life. And we will not take her back, right? Because she's not part of the community anymore. I think that's the bottom line for Percy in refusing this burial, this work of corporal work of mercy, is that this person was, as you said, unabashed. She was recalcitrant. She refused to admit what she did was wrong, and she doesn't deserve to be with us eternally. She's cut off. Yeah, I mean, I just you do feel for some of the appellants who got because they were dispersed in several different groups, and some of their letters are actually among the most affecting of the entire corpus. They say, like I said, we don't have money for candles, we don't have money for this, that, the other thing. We're basically starving. I think they really thought that they would get out on their own and lay people would come together to support them because they were persecuted, and the true spiritual, exemplars of the convent, and that did not happen. People just said, no, we don't want anything to do with this. And so, I think there's a sense too that some of these women got caught up in something that was much bigger than themselves and didn't quite realize what was happening to them. Their passions kind of tore them away, and really it's a very human drama ultimately.
Yeah, very much. Some of them were even admonished by the families for daring to contradict the abbess. You were a good girl up to now. You have lived such a long part of your life as an exemplary nun, and now you have totally smeared and marred your reputation by daring to contradict the authority of the one who's been elected your abbess, but who's also a Percy, that is to say, one of the most prominent noble families in England at the time. So.
Yeah, I was literally thinking that as well when Jamie was talking, that like, not only did they get dragged out of the convent in the middle of the night, but then also none of their families support them either. Like that letter where it's just like, yeah, the letters from their families where you're like, no, you need to obey. Yeah, as you've just said. Anyway, yeah.
Well, and there you see how the visible nature of the scandal is affecting people besides the nuns, right? That, because it's a point of pride. My daughter is a nun at this convent, right? And they're doing their bit praying for the conversion of England. And oh no, now my daughter is a nun who disobeyed her abbess in this very visible and scandalous manner, and now I'm embarrassed. And even the original, the anonymous letter, there's this Ruins of Troy anonymous letter. It kind of comes from that same point, but from the opposite viewpoint, right? That Percy is being so scandalous in her overbearing, tyrannical way that this is negatively impacting our daughters who are in this, and our relatives who are in this convent. We need to fix it. So there is this sense of, they're physically separated, but there is this sense of the importance of the convents to English Catholics and the importance of those familial ties. And it is about partly the reputation of those English Catholics who have relatives in those convents. Okay. So yeah, the scandal reaches out with its inky fingers and touches many, many people that you wouldn't think of.
And thinking of making this scandal visible, obviously, Jamie, I've had the pleasure of working on this corpus with you for quite a few years now. And the edition is going to make all of these things very public, for the first time available to anybody who wishes to grab a copy of that volume when it comes out, to read translations of transcriptions and translations and annotations and explanations and analyses, to bring all of this out into the open. And this is something that part of me still doesn't feel entirely comfortable with, because we are doing something which had been absolutely forbidden to generations and generations of nuns over 4 centuries. Now, the community has died out, but there still are some Benedictine nuns in England, even though they may not be their direct descendants. And I just wanted to ask you how you felt this might have an impact on the communities, or indeed on the reading public, on the future researchers, etc. I think as a historical resource, it's going to be incredibly valuable. I've no doubt of that, even though I'm now blowing my own trumpet somehow, but our trumpet. But I'm also unsure, ethically speaking. There's a part of me that feels that we are exposing what they took such great cares in hiding carefully. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I have felt uneasy about it myself. I think though that at some point someone is going to do it. Or maybe not. Maybe they would have been deterred by the size of the corpus. But I think, to me, the important part is the way that it's being framed, because there is this kind of subgenre of historical work on like nuns behaving badly, and look at these scandals, and just playing it up for titillation and laughs. And the reading public will judge, but I don't think that our edition does that. I think it takes it very seriously and says, look, this is a major event that touches on these important facets of English Catholic history, and that helps us understand English Catholic history from a completely new vantage point, and that these nuns behaving badly weren't just doing it because they're silly women, but because they thought that it had real. Yes, thank you, Liz. I find it very annoying. Liz is commenting in the chat that she appreciates us pushing back on the nuns behaving badly discourse. But they were doing it because they took it seriously. It was about the health of their souls and the souls of their families, the future of their nation. That's how they saw it. So I hope that the fact that we are taking it seriously, and we're not, having it published in some salacious format with comic book nuns on the cover, will, will
Now you're being very precise.
Yes, exactly. You know what I'm talking about. And so that it will help people see this is serious work and not just an attempt to trivialize nuns. Now, I don't know how there's really only one community left at this point, which is the Stanbrook community, which is Cambrai, but the Olton house, the Ghent nuns, and the Paris house, the Coleridge nuns have now incorporated themselves with it. I don't know how they will react to this. It's not really about them ultimately, although some of the Cambrai nuns, did come from Brussels originally. So I don't know how they're going to feel about it. My sense has always been that the nuns are grateful for the work that we do because it helps people to understand their spirituality and what they're about. This is not particularly edifying, though, is the right word to use. So I'm a little nervous about how they're going to receive it. Yeah, I don't know.
I think as well, like it, I don't know whether I read too much into this now with the Brussels scandal, but with some students, I was reading The Foundation of Boulogne, possibly, that source, and I feel like there's so many oblique references in this advice for this new Benedictine convent about like what not to do. So it's like, don't let visitors in unless you have to. And I feel like I can't think off the top of my head now, but I feel like using within the kind of institutional memory of these communities, even if subsequently it tries to be a bit buried and suppressed, I think not letting this happen again was very important to everybody. So when thinking about making this more visible now, I think even then lessons were being learned. So I would hope that the community at Stanbrook would look on this, as you say, Jamie, and for you, Laurence, as well as like an invaluable contribution to conventual history and the history of women and their political, and their engagements broadly. But that also, like, as an example of like what happens when things go terribly, terribly wrong. So yeah, I've had like the tug on the heartstrings when you're translating a letter that's, like, I don't want anyone else to see this except for you. And you're like, oh, soz, here I am. But I think like, as long as you're, as you say, not sensationalizing it in a negative way or trying to mock them or anything, then yeah, I think it's okay.
That's the exact issue I wanted to discuss, because I think in visibilizing the scandal, there are many reasons for doing so. There are many ways of doing so. Making a scandal visible can be for laughs, as you pointed out. A scandal is always going to be selling. It sells newspapers and tabloids nowadays. It sells, and it's sold back in the day as well. All those, anti-religious pamphlets, etc., they were extremely popular. So it would be easy to make this visible in order to sensationalize, in order to titillate, in order to entertain. But I also think that a scandal can be made visible in different ways for a different purpose, and not necessarily to serve as a lesson or, be moralizing, but to be a tool and a resource for whomever wishes to use it as such.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this more. The Cambrai convent, which is what Stanbrook comes from. For them, this would just show why they needed Cambrai to exist, right? That in fact, Augustine Baker had the spiritual advisor who really shaped the spirituality at Cambrai, was very anti-Jesuit. He thought that Jesuits had no place advising convents because their spirituality was too active. And in that case, the Brussels, issues could be said to illustrate that, right? These women have been activated and they are acting on it in a way that shows that it's incompatible with monastic spirituality. So yes, it's embarrassing, and some of their founders came from there, but to them, it might just reinforce what we do is the right way. And look, we're the ones who survived. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I think maybe they would be okay with it from that perspective. It's not as if we're publishing something that shows that Augustine Baker was this, heinous murderer or something. We're not we're not digging up scandals about their own convent, but providing context on how their convent came to be. And so I think maybe from that point of view, it's adjacent to them, but it doesn't actually, have much bearing on their own history or their spiritual identity. So it probably will be okay. I don't know. They'll let me know, I guess.
Yes, we'll soon find out. Indeed.
Yes.
Any other questions maybe from the audience? Feel free, we still have a little bit of time. I'm just scrolling to see because I can't see everybody at the same time. No? Okay. Right. I was just taking a little bit of time to check because obviously sometimes when we're online, there's a little delay of, in wanting to discuss things and putting your hand up, etc. Just one more thing, perhaps, about the desire to write a common history. For instance, if we take Neville's history of the 5 communities. So some years after all these scandals abated, Anne Neville, another nun, tried to gather the various writings of the 5 Benedictine communities, English communities in exile, to write a common history. And it struck me as an endeavor of community building beyond the walls of each individual community, writing a common history of the 5 communities, to me anyway, probably sprang from an effort at showing what the Benedictines as an order could do for and by English women. However, obviously, she chose some very specific sources when it came to the Brussels house, using mostly the sources that Vavasor gave her. Vavasor was anti-Percy during the times of the disputes, and I don't know. How do you feel about this idea of trying to write up and therefore to make visible the stories of the 5 together? It's not very common at the time, as far as I know. Do you think that was an attempt at erasing the disputes, the inner disputes, in order to make more visible a unity of spirit amongst nuns from different communities, but who nevertheless belonged to the same order, and to show a united front to future generations, not only of nuns, but of all the readers that could possibly get their hands on that history?
Yeah, it's a good question. And there are 2 of these comparative histories, because I know Emily's just working on this, but there's a Morist who also does a French, comparative history. And he and Neville are, they're talking to each other, obviously, they're contemporary. And I think maybe she was inspired by his decision to do that. I think what binds the community, those 5 communities, is their adherence to the Brussels statutes. So there's a sense that Cambrai and Paris are separate. They have their own statutes, which nonetheless are based on the Brussels statutes ultimately. But they have their own statutes. They have their own spirituality, which is not Jesuit. It's different, more contemplative way. And so I think they see themselves, the other 5 see themselves as a congregation. They refer to themselves as a congregation. And so it's trying to define this particular identity among the five of them. It's interesting to think about it in relation to the scandal. I see it almost more as a spiritual genealogy, right? So that kind of binding the five together so that even though they might be in separate locations, they have this filial piety toward one another in some way. I don't know. I hadn't thought of it as primarily being designed to deal with the scandal like Brussels.
I'm not sure it was primarily being
Yeah.
designed or influenced. It doesn't arise from the scandal, but I think perhaps it goes a little way to repair some of the damage.
Mm.
And I definitely would agree with you that it is more of a work of genealogy. This is where we stem from. This is the tree, that we built, and with all the various branches, but we all belong to the same one common ground. But I
think.
Sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think as well, there are questions of audience for this as well, like how far you take seriously Neville's statements that these are just writings for herself. And yeah. And then also, but I mean, ultimately, I mean, what I would argue about this material is that it's part of the kind of part of the nuns' like apostolic activity as part of their missionary endeavors from within the cloister to preserve the history of the English mission, both their own role within it, but then also as part of the kind of future reclaiming of Catholic England to show the genealogy and the history of their congregation. And it's, yeah, as Jamie says, I think she is obviously being influenced by the Moorists, and then also later, you've got Bennett Weldon's History of the Benedictine Congregation that incorporates a lot of the material from the Benedictine convents as well, writing these kind of collective histories of whole orders and congregations became quite a common thing to do, at least for the Benedictines. Anyway, yeah, but I think it is interesting to think about the implications of what it does make invisible, which is in reality, the reason why Cambrai and Ghent are founded is because of this terrible drama. I mean, maybe there is an argument to be made that the Brussels house was really overcrowded and that they may well have produced these two offshoots anyway. But I think to erase that actual origins of the community, is quite successful. But yeah, and it clearly does have an impact because, like, looking at the stuff that gets sent to Dodds at the for his histories of for English Catholicism at the diocesan archives in Westminster, like the Brussels house don't even list Champney as a confessor. Like they just skip over this whole period. Like they're like, oh yeah, and then anyway, I'm wittering now, but they also one of the nuns that then sends this in the 18th century says we have these 4 nuns that we have heard were like really, really pious and wonderful. And one of them is Columba Gage, who they refused to bury because of her massive agitation throughout this entire thing that was never even buried in the Brussels house. And in the material that they've sent to Dodds, there's a few others as well who are all appellants. They're like, we've heard that Columba was one of the best. And it's like, oh, that's really interesting because it's not the impression that you would get from having read this. So, and I need to think more about that. But in terms of like the narratives that are then being circulated in the convent about some of the leading appellants are very interesting. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you. Jamie, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Neville is very interested in kind of documentation and documenting history. And so she's all the things that she's busy collecting things into these compendia. I think also so that's part of it. And she indicates that it's an abridgment of something else, right? So there's some other document that she's drawing on. I wish the other thing had survived, but it didn't. And she also is an interesting nun because she's more mobile than most. And so she had been at, she had been at Ghent, she had been at Dunkirk. I believe my impression is that she had also spent some time at Brussels, although that's not clearly delineated, but she had been at most of these houses, and so she had seen them physically, and I think had this sense of herself as belonging to something greater than an individual house. She wasn't like the typical kind of nun who professes and then stays there in that Benedictine, profession of I'm going to stay in this space. They moved her around a lot.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe she had more of a bird's eye perspective on the congregation than other people and could see herself as belonging to this larger phenomenon. But yeah, I mean, it is very interesting to see how the story gets turned on its head once the appellants take charge of the convent, and the way that they write about Percy, the way that Neville writes about Percy, for example, is kind of, well, we have to admit she must have had some outstanding virtues to have founded this convent, but moving on to the next people. And you can also see this movement in Toby Matthews' Life of Lucy Knatchbull, where he talks about the foundation of Ghent, and he has this great metaphor that sometimes a body grows and it gets too large for its clothes, and so therefore, this just in that similar way that they had to spin some women off to this other institution. It is true that Brussels became quite large, but my sense is that they had a large campus that they were on, that they were okay. And it's not the first time this was just successful, that Lucy Knatchbull and several other novices attempted to found a new Benedictine convent in Louvain. And that didn't work out. And that was in 1609. But again, it was similar. It was because of these concerns about access to Jesuit priests. So it does seem to be the case that controversies resulted in the foundation of new houses. But that is very much swept under the rug in Neville's and Matthews. If you read those, then you would feel that there wasn't that much to the scandal.
And Etienne as well, the French chronicle,
yeah.
The same. It just is the body grew too big for its cloths. And the building was too small, the community was growing too large, therefore, very peacefully, we established another community.
Right.
That's all there is to it if you read those accounts.
And I think that's true. The Ghent house, it established multiple filiations, and it's true there that, that was not due to a lack of, concord, but because they were stretched to the max and they didn't have the ability to continue providing for that number of people. So and this of course is during the Civil Wars when alms are going down, as Emilie mentioned, and so they just spin them off into different houses. But that is not true of the first two, those Brussels filiations. So it is interesting how they attempt to disguise it. And the fact that this is coming from someone like Matthew, who's a Knatchbull partisan, even he knows this is something we should hush up because it's unflattering to Knatchbull. It's unflattering to everyone. I think that's the bottom line. Nobody comes out looking good in this story.
No, indeed. Well, unless there are any other questions, I think this is a good note to end this great talk on. Just checking once more. I can't see any raised hands. Please let me know if I'm missing anybody. But if there aren't any questions or comments, I would like once again to thank you very much, Emilie and Jaime. It's been, as always, a great pleasure to see you and hear you discuss this material, which is so very complex. And I will, as I always do, I will try and edit this, and I will do a little bit of work on the video because we had a few technical problems that interrupted the flow, but it will be available on our YouTube channel in the next few days, maybe a couple of weeks maximum. So, but I will let you know, of course. Thank you so much, and thank you, of course, to all the attendees far and wide. Thank you and goodbye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.